Hey, thanks for joining me this morning, Dr. Lansing. Um,
Good to be here.
yeah, I appreciate you. We're probably going to cover a lot of ground because your book that you wrote with Colonel Wayne Quist is coming out soon. And you've been working with veterans for quite some time. And so I know that you are going to be able to provide to our audience on Spotlight on Spirit a lot of information in regards to PTSD, coming back from war, some of the traumatic experiences they have, and maybe connect some of the spiritual aspects that are connected with trauma.
Sounds good.
Okay. I feel like I should just give you the microphone and let you go because you have a wealth of experience. And
That might
so,
be kind of dangerous. So,
but
uh,
do you want to tell me a little bit about how do you define spirituality in trauma? Is there a spiritual component to that?
most definitely, and even the most secularized forms. And I'm a licensed mental health professional. I'm also have a degree in pastoral counseling. But even the most secularized models talk about mind, body, spirit. And if you look at groups like AA, they talk about your higher
Hmm.
power. And I remember hearing Rick Warren, who wrote Purpose Driven Life, one time on a
Yeah,
tape. He says, "I don't have enough faith to be an atheist." And I thought
right.
that was kind of funny. That if I get up in the morning and I'm the end of the equation, and this is as good as it gets, I want a refund. And so the
Right.
idea of having
Yeah.
something, and this goes back, one of the classes I had to take, one of my degrees is in sociology, and I had to take anthropology as part of that. And even going back to the very beginning of time, there was a spiritual element. It was different in things that people didn't
Hmm.
understand science, and they called
Hmm.
it the mysterious tremendum, mysterious and tremendous, scary. And so we explained eclipses and thunderstorms and things like that. Uh, to whatever our culture said, or it was Thor with the
Hmm.
lightning bolts, or the Pennsylvania Dutch talked about the thunder sounding like a bowling alley. And
Oh,
but there was something that went beyond just simply what was within ourselves. And if we hang on to that, and if we look at it as a Christian, if you look at, for example, in Hebrews 11:1, it says, "Faith is what's not yet seen and not yet
hmm,
realized." And we look at that, and it says, "I can do all things through Christ Jesus who strengthens me." In Philippians, I think it's 4:13. That's part of what goes on. It says, doesn't mean that God's a video game, doesn't mean that my spirituality says I can do stupid things and get, set
hmm.
free from it. But it
Right.
means that God's going to come up with something, not what I want necessarily, but definitely what I need. And so
Yeah.
when I've been going through the fire from various times, and amazingly, when I was in Vietnam, I was a um, Christmas and Easter type of Christian.
Hmm.
Brought up Catholic, went to Catholic schools, and know the wrath of rulers, and that,
Hmm.
and I can show you my knuckle scars. But when I was in Vietnam, Christmas, Easter, I remember going through basic training. They did a conveyor belt type of confession,
Hmm.
and we were in a big gym or some room like that, and they had the priest with his back to us, and we'd go through and rattle off whatever we wanted, and they'd throw their prescription at you, and you'd go on, and so now you can go off to war and die without going to hell. And
Hmm.
then that was what the kind of what the joke was. And it wasn't until 14 years after I came back from Vietnam that I
Hmm.
really grew in my faith, and I found out what a relationship is with Christ, and that incorporated. But during that time, and I forget where I saw it, there's a poster that says, the footprints in the sand. And I have a
Oh,
statue
sure.
at home that a friend of mine gave me, that when there were only two, that's when I was carrying you. And even when I wasn't following God, God was there with me.
Yeah.
And had it be, when I go back and I look at the things that happened, that I shouldn't have survived, for some reason or another did. because that was
Yeah.
God's plan. And people say, well, you were just lucky. What about the people that didn't
Right.
survive? I don't know. I'm not going to question the creator of the universe, who is much smarter than I will ever dream of being,
Yeah.
and say I can figure it out. I can't figure it out, and that strengthens my faith. When things come and happen that make no sense, it's got to come from a force, a power much greater than me.
Yeah.
And
Mhm. Well, one of the things that I think about is if we didn't have a spiritual being, if we were just mind and body, the physical, the real, the corporal, or the physical piece of us, would trauma be trauma? Would our minds react the same way to good experiences and bad experiences? What is that qualitative element that we have within ourselves that defines trauma as trauma and good times as good times? Does that make sense?
yeah, and I think one of the things that uh, the one element. Somebody asked me that one time.
Hmm.
What does faith do for you? And I says one word: hope.
Hmm.
And if I don't have that element, I've got to figure it out on my own. Maybe
Right.
I've got to handle it on my own. And there's no, And if you look at um, already today, I've talked with a couple of the vets that I work with
Hmm.
that are out there, and they're this weekend with the drone strikes that were going on in Israel and stuff like that.
Yep.
And I myself am thinking, I wonder if this is how people felt in 1940
Hmm.
when, you know, before the
Right
World War II
before.
happened and everything. And yeah, we didn't have the internet and we didn't have some of the other factors that are there, but that was part of it. And but yesterday when I was teaching Sunday school,
Hmm.
I got to talk about it. God's still in charge. And
Yeah.
if it wasn't, because there's stuff, I worked in intelligence. I still got a pretty good grasp on what I think is going on that maybe a lot
Hmm.
of people aren't aware of. And, you know, I'm careful who I talk about that with because I don't want to traumatize people.
Yeah.
But God is still in charge. And if that weren't the
Hmm.
case, I'd be either mobilizing, stocking up on stuff, or, finding a nice big cave to hide
Right.
in. But God is still in charge,
Yeah.
and I don't have to completely figure it out on my own. I have to be active. The first two letters of God is go. The Great
Hmm.
Commission. Jesus' final word says, "Go forth all the world." He didn't say, "Go home and sit in your closet and sing."
Hmm.
And that's kind of the thing. So I'm still going to be out there, and the work I do with veterans each and every day, and work this conversation with you, and I've
Hmm.
already had a couple sessions this morning, and
Hmm.
tonight I'm talking to a American Legion group down in Stewartville, and Wednesday's the Veterans Day at the Capitol,
Yeah.
and
Are
we're
you
going.
going? Oh,
Oh
good.
yeah, oh yeah.
Okay. I'll
So
see you there.
so we'll be up there, and we got a van leaving from the DAV, and I hope I make the bus because I don't really want to drive up there. But if I do, I do. But that's the kind of stuff that takes place, and I'm still seeing patients, and I don't just say, "Well, God's in charge; He'll fix it." Well, God gave me a brain, and He gave
Hmm.
me abilities, and He, I don't think, wants us to just sit around and wait for things to happen, And so that's where prayer
Hmm.
comes into play, and just a number of things, and so all the action that we go into and all the things that we put together to get through that point, driven by God, starting
Hmm.
with God, and you don't just pray and not call 911. You still call 911, but you pray when you do
Yeah.
that, and that's part that sometimes people miss. We've got some vehicles in place, and living here in Rochester, there's all these medical things they can do,
Hmm.
but that doesn't mean we don't pray.
It's a
You
both
know,
and. It's not an
it's
either
it's
or. It's a both and.
exactly, and you start out with that, and I have a good friend who runs a parachurch ministry called NCRC, Wendell Amstutz, and that's He and I co-authored a book back in the late '80s, and we traveled the country. And every time we'd go, we'd put that into play. I have a prayer that before I see each client that I read,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of helps me going through. I have another prayer that I give out when I do talks sometimes in churches on how to pray for mental health professionals.
Yeah.
And that's the stuff that coming into play that encompasses that. And if we don't do that, if we just go through that, and then, in AA they have 12 steps. Step 3 says surrender your life and will,
Yeah.
because Steve's way didn't work.
Right.
And so Judge Jody Williamson, who just retired from Dodge County, I remember her saying a lot of times, stop driving the bus. And she'd say that to people, because I'm the mental health person on the Dodge County Drug Court. And, she'd stop driving the bus. And, if you go through that, and I don't know how much you know about the steps, and I'm a recovering alcoholic. In May, I'll have 42 years of sobriety. But,
Congratulations.
going through that, and I didn't do it with the steps. I did it with F&F, faith and family, because I was dealing with PTSD, and I was dealing with a lot of other things as well. And, that was a process. But I know the steps, and I've worked with the steps. And step 4 is the one that's a shameless self-inventory. And I've talked to people who've done that a dozen times. Now, why? If you're doing a shameless self-inventory, it should be one and done. And then you do step 5, which is sharing it with someone along in there. And the reason, and that was something that Judge Williamson helped me realize. I didn't realize that until they're not doing step 3. They're not surrendering their life and will to their
Doing
higher
it on your
power.
own.
They're doing it on their own, or they give it to God and then they take it back. And that's what I see a lot of times. Well, I gave it to God,
Then you took it back. The next time
exactly.
it happened again, I took it back.
Wonder why that doesn't work. And so that's the part of that. And this summer we have a teaching team in our mini congregation at Kelley, where it's my home church, and we did a Max Lucado book called "You're Never Alone," and it talked about the miracles from the Book of John. And I already said that quote earlier in this conversation. God will always give you what you need, not necessarily what you want. And back when I was in 8th grade, there was this young lady that I really had a crush on. I prayed, I lit candles, I did extra church, I did everything, and all this. And she wouldn't give me the time of day if we were trapped in a clock factory. So, and why not? I'm praying to God, what is it? Well, again, somebody taught me, that God always answers our prayers sometimes. And I used to think yes or no, that's it, God's answer to our prayers. But, God, there's actually 4 things. Yes, no, not yet, and I have something better. And 11 years later, in March 13th, 1971, I met this student nurse who has now been my wife for will be 52 years in May.
Oh, so 52 is coming up.
God had listened to me instead of being much smarter than me, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. None of this would have happened. But God already knew that, in Dubuque, Iowa, which I couldn't even pronounce. First time I read it, I thought it was Dubuque or whatever.
Right,
And which is where I went to college. My wife was in nursing school. My wife Ann was in nursing school there, but God knew all that. And you can say, well, you were lucky and all these other things like this. Luck's got nothing to do with it.
Yeah, there's the accountability. You've talked about accountability. You've talked about trusting the unknown. And then you've also talked about this element of being with, which goes against the grain of American rugged individualism, that somehow we have to learn that we live our lives with individuals, with people. And that requires compromise, and it requires a lot of times change.
Friday, because my friend Wendell's doing this campaign, which is brilliant on respect. And I've done some speaking with him on that, and the last session, and we say, well, look at the problems in society. Well, There's got to get rid of guns. Well, guns existed when I was in high school. People would have their pickup trucks that go hunting on the way home and whatever. I grew up in upstate New York. We're up in the mountains. And mental health has existed since the beginning of time. And our book talks about that, about PTSD is something that wasn't called that, but it's been that for forever. And, what's different? All those other things. What's different is there's no longer a line. It's okay because there's no line, it's okay to do whatever we want to do, say whatever we want to say, and be whatever we want to be. And Judge Williamson, we're sitting in my office on Friday because her and I are working together at the National Day of Prayer, which is coming up on the first Thursday in May. And she's a speaker. I'm interviewing her, so which is pretty cool because we've done some stuff together before. She's a really cool lady, and she says it's not that complicated, and it isn't. And as a Christian, James 1:19, Ephesians 4:29, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry.
There's wisdom in that book.
Ephesians, a lot of it. And Ephesians says, let no unwholesome words come out of your mouth, but only what is helpful to those who listen. Now, if we just would practice those two things, what would happen to the condition of the world as you know it right now?
Yeah.
And that's the thing. And so that's the thing. But people instead, for whatever reasons, and somebody one time says it's a case of inverted eyeballs. Eye contact doesn't mean I am more important than everybody else. Eye contact means making a connection. And that we get caught up in those things, and the negativism and the lack of respect, and that's what this campaign that my friend has put together, and within the city of Rochester 2024, the year of respect, and they've had a number of different speakers, and they're going to continue on with that.
Because respect is something that happens with. First, it starts with you, and then it's with. You can't just leave it with yourself. You have to practice it with other individuals.
One of the main pillars, and as a mental health professional, there's two pillars, and I'm a cognitive therapist, and it's funny because sometimes people say, well, cognitive behavioral therapy, where's that in the Bible? And I go, Philippians 4:8, that's exactly, think on these things. And God's incredible creation has given us a brain that positive things strengthen the different part of the brain than negative. And they've measured that now. They have devices that they can do that with, looking at brain activity. But person-centered treatment planning. So, number one, so if you were my patient, I'd be a Kelleyologist. And what does Kelley need? And that's the kind of the process. Now, I use cognitive therapy. I use some other kinds of tools that I've learned along the way. The other is what's called trauma-informed care. And trauma-informed care says it's not so much what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. Tell me your story. Tell me what happened to you. And then once I hear that, how did that impact you? And so one of the things in the Respect Project, and is one of the things that I do a lot, and there's an instrument out there called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, that looks at childhood trauma, and that's pretty cool. And sometime in another podcast, I can go through how that even came to be. But the idea is what happened before does an impact. So tell me what happened to you. And how did that affect, when I do trauma therapy, how did it affect your feelings of safety, trust, power and control, self-esteem, and intimacy? Those are the 5 main areas that are impacted. And I'm certified in something called cognitive processing therapy, where you actually teach people tools on how to analyze those things with what's called stuck points. But if you're acting in a way that's abrasive, adversive, annoying, whatever to me, my first question would be, not that this person's a jerk, but why are they a jerk? What's going on? What's happening in their world today? Because most people don't get up in the morning and say, I'm going to destroy the world today. There's a few, but in general, people just want to get through the day and process things, and they do it maybe differently than we do. But help me understand what that is. And the best phrase in all the school and all the stuff I've learned is, help me understand.
Help me
followed
understand.
by tell me more.
Tell me more.
And then using that as a springboard. And I didn't invent that. A guy by the name of Socrates did back several thousand years ago. It's called the Socratic method.
Mm-hmm.
And we write about that in the book, because Socrates, before he was Socrates, the cool philosophy guy,
Yeah.
he was an infantryman, and that's in our book. Yeah, thank you. There it goes. So
There
yeah,
it is.
we talk about it, and Colonel Quist, if he hadn't been a career military officer, he was in the Air Force, full bird colonel. Um, if he hadn't been a career military officer, he would have been a history professor.
Oh, that
And
makes sense.
he is just a science, and he has a museum he owns in Northfield. He's
Okay.
it's a nonprofit,
Okay.
and he does that. And he's, when we were writing the book, we started talking about uh, what the effects of trauma are.
Mm-hmm.
And trauma, if you look, in the first part of the book, it talks about trauma affects three major parts of the brain: the hippocampus, which is where your memory is stored. It
Mm-hmm.
shrinks, and because it shrinks, all your memories are kind of clapped in together.
Mm-hmm.
And it affects your prefrontal cortex, which is what processes things coming in there. Is it real? Is it Memorex? That old commercial that was on.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets smaller, so it processes information in a different way. And then the amygdala, which is the smoke alarm in your brain, that lets you know, say, danger, danger, Will Robinson, that's the thing there. That gets bigger and it gets less controllable. And so
So,
every event
okay.
seems like a forest fire, not a campfire.
So what I'm hearing you saying is this external traumatic experiences affects the internal size and operability of the brain
It physically changes the brain.
physically. And then also to connect that, good changes the brain too. Thinking positive, external, surrounding yourself with positive actually
Yeah.
changes the brain too.
And then, and it doesn't, with PTSD,
Mm-hmm.
the hippocampus doesn't unshrink,
Mm-hmm.
but there's things there, but you can learn to manage it. And what I tell people, there's no done button, but there's not an off switch either. And there's tools you can use. And as someone with PTSD myself, I don't sit in a restaurant with my back to the door.
Mm-hmm.
I know where the exits are. I back into parking spaces and all of that stuff like that, because it's still, if I don't understand, I'm hyper vigilant. And
Which that's a
that's
trait of the military.
trait of the military, but it's also one of the characteristics of PTSD.
So
There's
it's
5
just,
criteria.
you're just making me think. So I've been trained in the military, and the things that you do, I do.
Mm-hmm.
But I have never had PTSD as far as I'm aware. I don't think I have the characteristics. So I'm just wondering if the military has taken these characteristics, or is PTSD an extreme training? I'm not saying that right.
It's an extreme impact. But
Okay.
if you go back and, you were at that talk I did up
Mm-hmm.
in, Apple Valley or wherever it
Yep.
was, and so you remember what I talked about there, that from the second you step off the airplane,
Mm-hmm.
your world, your processing, your programming changes.
All
And
right.
you learn, and the joke I tell, I go further, I learned that there are 16 different uses of the F word. And
Right.
you could, it's a verb
Yeah.
modifier, as an adjective, and all this.
Yes.
And learn new things about my family and myself, and all this other
Right.
stuff like this. And people go, that's not this. No, you go into war, if you've ever been in combat, that's the kind of stuff, that cultural change that keeps you alive.
The muscle. So they
And
have to do the muscle memory retraining for you.
yeah, and you go through that, and it becomes a different culture. And when people say, well, how come, and I talk, difference between veterans and normal people, I talk about that in terms of, you're in a different culture, and we understand that with races and genders and all that other like this. 7% is the official thing. Actually, if you run the current numbers, it's 5% have ever served.
Okay.
And
In
when you look
America.
at, then 1 to 3% have been in combat. And if you look at the difference in how and you work a lot with veterans, so you know what I'm talking about. And maybe, you know, some of your leadership doesn't, your listenership doesn't. But in the book, we also talk about the whole thing you go through as part of the training. You develop this bond. You know, it's a violent, no nonsense. It's not a debating society. It's, you know, get her done, make it happen. There's a very well-defined architecture of leadership and everything that maybe it's not the best, but it saves a lot of time in terms of saying, okay, who now? And you don't get into voting over who shoots the gun or whatever, you know, goes in that.
Yeah.
And there's a very strong bond that goes there that only vets understand. And the other thing, and this is where what I do falls into play, only 1 out of 6 therapists, and I'm a licensed therapist by the state of Minnesota, I'm a licensed independent clinical social worker, 1 out of 6 therapists are veterans. So
That's
I did
a big number, actually.
yeah, I did a talk down in Winona to the mental health center. I was the only veteran in the room. And I did a 2-hour presentation, and this is something that I'm hoping to do about 20 to 25 of those this year is you know, helping people understand veterans. So I've worked with mental health centers. I did training with the Olmsted County Sheriff and Police for their crisis team on working with veterans. I've done that 3 times. I do it with, like tonight, and this tonight is just going through, because one of the things that we need to do, we're a 501c3 nonprofit, is fundraising. But you know, for the purpose of providing free PTSD treatment for veterans in consultation with groups, working with businesses, going into businesses and saying, okay, you have veterans that work for you. This is the things you need to be aware of. This is why veterans are the way veterans are, and this is how the perceptions are, and this is what the culture does, and you know, and so on. And it's not just a black and white kind of thing, you know. And you know, I have good friends who are Marines, and they call what I did. I was in the chair force, they call it, not the Air Force. And you know, and I joke about how, well, there's still, you know, it's easy to understand why the Marines were founded in a bar, you know, and you go through there. But at the end of the day, we're all brothers and sisters. And then, you know, I also do some work with first responders, and I say, well, you're my cousins from the same family. And you know, and there's a group that is statewide now called the Invisible Wounds Project that deals with first respond. And I've worked in therapy with a lot of firefighters and law enforcement like that. Same kind of experience. I've also worked with assault victims. And the one difference with veterans and first responders is something called moral injury. So there's, you know, there's the fact of, you know, you went through the military, you understand that and what takes place, and you know, how you're reprogrammed, you know, and you become part of a different culture. And you can go through, you know, my wife and I go out to Black Hills a lot on vacation. We're driving around Custer State Park, and this guy drives up in front of me, and he's got a retired Air Force plate on his car, and he looks at my Vietnam vet plate on my car, and we made eye contact, instant. You know, and I'm sure you've experienced the same thing too. You walk into a room. 4 of us went out that are on our board to Sioux Falls to there's a place out there that's a vet center that's in Sioux Falls near the airport, and it's a huge building. And the American Legion VFW kind of co-op with it, and they've got a 1,900-person auditorium and a gun range and a restaurant and a museum and all this. And Gary Sinise Foundation had this play called The Last Out. And it's a play that was put together. It's funded by the Gary Sinise Foundation, and your listeners remember, you know, Gary wasn't a veteran, but he's really he's got honorary membership. He was Lieutenant Dan in the Forrest Gump movie, and he did some other plays. So we went out there. We went into this building. There's 500 people. We didn't know a soul. And Wayne had some contact with one of the people that coordinate that, but we'd never met her. And she was I think from Tennessee, Lieutenant Colonel on guard. And he coordinates events and stuff. Within 5 minutes, we were home, and we're up on stage, you know, before the event with in a circle with the Gold Star families and all that. And there was no need to explain anything and to go through any, you know, it was there, and that's always the case. Now, there is a continuum. Not all vets are cut from the same mold. We're not robots. and there's a continuum, and politically, socially, educationally, whatever. But in general, there's still that common connection.
Yeah.
That's infused with when you go through basic, when you get done with basic, when you go on duty, when you serve, when you deploy, and that connection is in there. And I see that with folks. Now, the difference, because the brain changes I talked about are the same with any trauma victim in varying degrees. The difference with veterans, first responders, people that were trafficked, fall into that sometimes, and I've worked with a number of women who have been trafficked, is that moral injury. I didn't ask to be assaulted, but I was told that I had to go forth. And if you ever saw the movie The American Sniper at the very beginning with Chris Kyle, very beginning, he's got this 8-year-old kid in his crosshairs. And he had to pull the trigger because that 8-year-old kid happened to have an IED that he was going to put in the back of a troop carrier. And he went down, and then this woman in a burqa picks it up, and then, same thing that goes on. That's all well and good when you're out there in the middle of the action. Once you go back home, once you sit down, and I might have told that story when I was up in Apple Valley, but one of my best friends is a guy named Tom McQueen, who's a hospice chaplain. He's my age. I'm 77, down in Florida. And Tom is pretty cool. He's people our age, people say, why don't you go out to pasture? And I don't like pastures, so that's why I moved out of Iowa. And so, and he was a fire commissioner. His son's a fire captain down there in one of the smaller towns around Tampa, and he was fire commissioner for a couple terms, and he's written books and all this other stuff. Well, now he's a hospice chaplain, and I did a talk back in, I think it was September, October, for a hospice on end of life issues for veterans. And as part of when I was doing my research, so I called Tom up and I said, help me out here. I know end of life, I know veterans, but you're a hospice chaplain. This is for hospice. He said, I'll give you one good story. And they had this guy who was 97 years old. World War II veteran, was on Omaha Beach on D-Day, and if you ever saw the beginning of Saving Private Ryan, the first 8 minutes of that onslaught, or first 20 minutes, 8,000 people were killed or wounded. And so here's this guy, and he was on Omaha Beach, and he went through Europe, and he was involved in some of the really heavy, ugly, nasty action that goes through, and he saw a lot of people die. 97 years old, he's got a week to live. They do a ceremony, pin a pin on because he was in the Army. And after it's all over, everybody goes away, they put the cake away and all this. It's only this gentleman and my friend Tom, they're in the room, is a chaplain, and he calls over and he says, I shouldn't have killed those people. They had families too. Now, combat, justified, whatever it goes through. But these demons been flying around inside this guy's head for 75 years. And why is Grandpa grumpy? Why is, and that was the whole thing, to help people understand, that this is what trauma does to people. This is what PTSD does to people and what goes through. But then when you put the moral injury part into there, that's an accelerant for what you would see with PTSD, which is already significant enough as it is. And then there's something called LOSS, late onset stress syndrome, and I actually have a test I can measure that with. And so, you're talking about that as you get older, and I found that myself. I didn't join any of these. I didn't join the VFW, American Legion, this until I was in my 50s, and it's part of there. And then I'm on Facebook groups, and I, doing more with vets, and it's been a while, and but this is what, and I think I sent you some stuff from a couple of things. As you get older, you start reminiscing, you start looking back and you're saying, what if, why didn't I? And you talk about the shame and the guilt and the regrets and all that other that goes on there. With veterans, there's another special layer that's onto there. And that's where, and again, with Tom being a chaplain, he is a spiritual aspect, but he's also got a counseling degree. So he knows that. He knows, what that is as well. That's that part that people need to realize.
Yeah,
That
the moral injury.
if you've ever, one of the things, Tim wrote that article that was in the American Legion newspaper that there, and the one quote he put up in headlines, I was really glad he did. He said, "Never ask a veteran if they ever killed anybody."
Right.
Because if you've ever taken a human life, and what that a 97-year-old gentleman said in his final moments of life is pretty typical. And if you ever, no matter what the justification is, no matter what all this other things that go through, it loses its sting, but it never completely goes away.
Yeah, it's not like the movies at all.
No, I talk about, Clint Eastwood, and hey, make my day, and then he goes back and finishes his hot dog.
Yeah.
I have a video. There was a young lady out in Oklahoma that week after her husband died of cancer. 18-year-old girl, 3-month-old baby, husband dies of cancer, and these two individuals, I got to watch my language here. We can't use some of the words, but these two individuals stalked her and tried to break into her house, and she was with one shot. Fortunately, her husband taught her how to shoot, and she was on 911 on dispatch for 21 minutes. She lived rural, and she shot, and the guy comes through the door, and she comes through. One shot, situation was neutralized. 3 months later, I saw her on this interview with Dr. Phil, and she's still torn up.
Oh, sure.
She had to take a life, and she had no other choice because these two, a 3-month-old healthy baby, probably worth $250,000 or more on the black market if that's what their intent was, but they had no good intent coming in and breaking in her door.
Yeah.
And yet she's still, the rest of her life, she's not going, oh, let's go finish lunch. That made that impact on her.
Yep.
And that's the difference. And that doesn't change. And there's people who say, well, and they find ways. I got one guy that, I worked with, no remorse. Well, he's drinking a case of beer a day.
Yeah, somehow you gotta
nullify. And one of the characteristics of PTSD is numbing.
Yep.
That's one of the 5 criteria. And so you go back and you look at it, but the impact that makes, and even if you haven't taken a life, the fact you're out there in that setting dealing with the events as you do in a totally different way than the civilian world can understand. And then coming back to that civilian world, back to that parallel dimension, and expecting to act like that dimension, not the one you came out of. And I have a friend who's a VSO and vet service officer, which is the incredible people from the county that help us, get benefits.
She's on your
and
board.
Yeah.
And so, Jennifer Shoemaker. Shout out to Jennifer. She's a wonderful person.
Awesome. Yeah, she's and she got me my first rating after 50 years of being denied with the VA. But she told me one time the first week she was home, she slept outside. And I've heard that where I sleep next to the bed, or I don't sleep real well because I love my wife and family, but they aren't trained in small arms fire.
Yeah.
And I know when I was deployed, I'm with people who I can feel safe with because they've got the same skills I have.
Yeah.
And that's the thing in there. So, and Jennifer, people that talking about it, she does a group she's now done for 14 years at the VFW in Rochester that is a PTSD support group. The majority of the people there are veterans, though we've got 3 people that come frequently that are assault victims, rape victims.
So it's open to anyone.
And so it's people with PTSD, and and accept it, at least by and large, and I go there, I take my doctor hat off at the door. Sometimes I have to put it back on when something comes up, but I'm there. That helps me. And I kept it a secret for 14 years. And you talk about how God works on you. So in 1984, 3 things happened. In June, In June I had a experience in a bookstore in Albany, New York, about um, a secular book, Success Through Positive Mental Attitude, and I never really thought about what thinking was and what, and I got some of that in college, but not in how your thought controls your outcomes.
Sure. Yep.
And so there, and then in September, I was at a Amway meeting. I was involved in that for for a while, and they did a worship thing at the end, and that's where I was born again. That's why I accepted Christ.
Oh my! At
And
Amway.
so at an Amway meeting, Kansas City, Missouri, 2 weeks later, my wife and I went to a church because we were both brought up Catholic, and nothing wrong with Catholic, but when you're not getting fed, where you go, and I wasn't being fed completely. So that was the case there. 2 weeks later, some friends of ours took us to a church in Dubuque, Iowa, and she came forth and accepted Christ. September, October, 2 months later, I'm at another big conference in Washington D.C. with another Amway thing like that, and it was there, and we were right out on a bus. Well, we're coming into town, and I see we go right past the Vietnam War Memorial, which was built, I believe, in '82. And a friend of mine goes, "What's that ugly? That's the ugliest." I says, "Well, that's the Vietnam War Memorial." And I said, it's, and again, Tim quotes that in that article that was in the newspaper that said, best thing about it is my name's not on it. And I have, I know I have friends that are on that wall. And so I go back, check in the hotel, was working on me. Middle of the night, I wake up, something pulled me out of bed, and we can get, was it my emotions? Was it God? Was it working on me? But I walked through Washington D.C., which has some very bad parts, and one of my strengths and beliefs in God is there had been angels all around me that night because I walked through some real bad neighborhoods, not knowing where I was going, but eventually wound up in front of the wall in a thunderstorm. And I sat there and I stared at my image in the wall for probably 2 hours or so. Came home with pneumonia, but that's when my healing finally started. Then '86, I moved to Rochester to be clinical director of a faith-based suicide crisis line, and 1 out of every 3 calls I got were from veterans. In '87, I gave a talk at Rochester Community College. It was a conference for women of Vietnam experience, looking at 2 groups, nurses that were there and then spouses that were at home. And that was when I told that story. My wife knew some about it. She didn't know the whole situation in front of that group because they asked me to talk about PTSD. And PTSD didn't officially make the roster until 1980 in the DSM-3 diagnostic manual. But so I told that story, and then '91 when Desert Storm happened, and you can go on down the list of all the things that came together. And so that was part of my growth and development formulation in working with veterans and also working with myself on the things that I'd experienced. And that's that picture, which in 1970 wasn't possible. It was pretty ugly to be a vet in 1970.
I've heard it was a terrible time.
Well, it's really kind of interesting, and even within service clubs, weren't real accepting of Vietnam vets. And I find it kind of ironic, and I don't know if this is a safe story to tell, but here we go. 1970, my aunt took me, who has been in World War II, to an American Legion meeting, and they threw me out.
They threw you out.
They threw me out. They said you weren't in a real war. You're not a real veteran. You killed babies, and so on and so forth. And I walked out not real happy. My aunt was, and she was shocked and whatever. But so moving forward, who runs those organizations now? Vietnam vets. And here I went from getting thrown out of a meeting to being on the cover of the Rolling Stone. And I don't blame any, because one of the things I learned that the impact is the same. The impact, how trauma affects people, and if you read the second parts of our book, and it talks about going back to the Greek and Roman times and everything else like this. The events change, the experiences change, but the impact of those things from the beginning of time till now transcends all cultures, all groups, all populations, because the brain is the brain. And God created the brain that way. And so when you went back and started looking at that and those impacts and talking with people, that's the bottom line. What happened to you? How did that impact you? And that's what I like about using cognitive processing therapy. You're not re-traumatizing somebody with telling the story again. But when I got asked to do this talk, and they originally, because I was running suicide crisis lines, talked to a lot of vets. They said, "Can you talk on suicide?" And I got on the committee, and they said, "Oh, by the way, could you also do something on PTSD?" And I'd heard about it. That was all I knew. I knew the 4 letters. And they gave me this booklet from the DAV, and it talked about the difference between Vietnam and other wars. And, World War II, you didn't come home until you came home, either dead, psychologically dead, or severely injured to where you're inoperative. You went over on a boat, you came back on a boat. I went from sitting in a combat zone to 65 hours later drinking a beer in downtown San Francisco. And
the time
there
element.
was no debriefing. There was no, it was just, we flew into Travis Air Force Base. We slept there because we got in at night. We went through half a day, signed the papers, out the door. Have a good life.
Individually.
And that was it. We were fighting. You join today, 12 months from today, your war ends. I join next month, 13 months from today. My war ends. So we're fighting different wars. Less than the Marines. The Marines had 13. They were there 13 months. But the DEROS, Date of Expected Return from Overseas, which is now called ETS, that came about by somebody in the Pentagon says, well, let's do this. We aren't going to count points like we did in Korea. And we're not going to, 12 months. That's all you got to do. Here's your goal. And people saw that goal and they said, wow, cool. If I just make it this 12 months, I'll get jobs I couldn't get. And I can date people that wouldn't date me before. And everything's going to be beautiful. And then they came home and it was worse than they anticipated. And there was no debriefing because PTSD didn't exist, until 1980. And this was 1970 when I got out. And even then, and even there's still some people. My co-author, until he went through a crisis in his life, 56 years dealing with unresolved trauma. Because when you're in the military now, they got the Suicide Project and 22 vets a day die and everything else like that. But that's the difference. So, of course, the World War II vets couldn't understand me as a Vietnam vet. And now the big problem with vets coming back is they've got all this social media. So I can, when I was there, it was either snail mail, or they had what they called Mars radio, or you could take out a second mortgage on your house because it was $10 a minute to call on a phone from there. And I was in the Philippines before I went to Vietnam, so it was same time zone, same everything else like this. Well, now you got all this social media stuff. So here I am in Vietnam. I get a letter 2 weeks later from my wife or my girlfriend or my mother or whatever that the toilet blew up, and if I was on active duty, there's base housing and things, and 2 weeks have passed. They got the mop out by now. Well, now I know what I have no control over quicker.
Yep.
And that's a whole different type of
Another
interaction.
layer of stress.
And the multiple deployments. I went there and stayed there for 2 years. Now they're going for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, and they go and then it's a whole other thing like this. So it's different. So the people that in 1970 looked at me in a different way, like I was an alien creature, makes sense. I have no malice toward them, and just like now looking at some of the things. And one of the big challenges, and that meeting that you and I were at up in Apple Valley, we had a Desert Storm vet, but other than that, there was nobody Iraq or Afghanistan there.
Yeah.
And we need to start getting younger people realizing, and that's what one of the goals of Veterans Empowered is start getting younger people. I'm 77. My co-author is 87. We probably only got another 20 years to do this, but
You'll make an
What's
impact.
what's the success and making an impact? Well, what's the succession and getting people? And we've got people on our
Yeah.
board now that are in their 30s and so on, and getting that involved. One of my goals is to train people in addictions. They have what they call peer specialists. It's a 40-hour course you can get certified to do.
Yep.
Almost like the things that take people places, go to court, do things there. But they've also got training in some
Yep.
specific things. I want to write a curriculum, and that's one of my goals hopefully by this summer or fall at the latest, to write a
Sure.
50-hour curriculum. I've got 4 people I want to train to be peer specialists on top of the direct trauma therapy that I do with people.
Are those paid positions or volunteer positions that you're talking about?
Depends on the fundraising. But
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
I'm
Okay.
a volunteer. I'm 80% disabled, so that helps, and I'm on Social Security. So same way with Wayne within there. So uh, you know, as we get, and that's where the books are available for veterans. Free of
Yeah.
charge, but we also sell them 20-piece, 3 for 50 or something like that. I guess it goes on, and we can do consulting with businesses, and we have done paid presentations and things like that. We got a grant application out now on some other things, and going out to service clubs and getting their assistance, and because 30% of gambling funds have to go for charity, and it's going straight back into our board is all volunteer. When I do therapy sessions now, when I left my old practice, I lost all my credentialing as far as insurance companies. And it would take me 6 months to get re-credentialed with all those.
Sure.
So I'm either seeing people for free or I charge so much a session. But when people can afford to do that, it goes right back into the nonprofit. And so we got with where that's at. And it's just Jesus says, "I've not come to be served, but to serve." And I really believe that that's what people like you and me were created to do. And a lot of the world doesn't understand that, and they don't understand it as much as they used to. And we got to have a 9/11 for people to realize their humanity. Unfortunately,
Yeah. One of the things that I learned long ago is we all want to be loved. Our deepest need is to be loved, but our biggest fear is to be loved, because therefore then we have to be known, right?
Very
And
well spoken.
pain is an indicator of something not functioning right in the body. It's the physical body's way of letting you know that there's, attention, alert, 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 there's something that's not working. And I think what you're doing and what so many of us want to do is we see the alert, alert, alert sign for like PTSD, moral injury, and we want to help. And so often individuals, they do their behaviors to mask it, or we tolerate behavior that could have been alleviated. The pain of PTSD could be alleviated to some degree, is what I hear you saying. Is like, I've got learned experience and professional training, right?
Yeah.
To help. I was in hospice. I was a hospice chaplain, and some of the most difficult deaths were veterans.
Yeah.
Who lived out and ostracized so many of their family members. They isolated themselves because their coping mechanisms just broke down. And then they find themselves in a gray, dark room at the end of life, all alone.
Yeah. One of our board members was 23-year Green Beret. And if you're familiar with the gray man concept, the gray man can fit into any crowd, be invisible, and all this other stuff, and he lives that. But he spent 22 years as a Green Beret, 11 years of actual active combat in places that we don't even know we were. And he still gets people, and he had that happen this past week, and they find out, well, how many children did you kill? And, it's impossible in war to avoid collateral damage. So you go out of your way not to have that happen. And people die. I saw people die in Vietnam because they were being careful about not doing collateral damage.
Yeah.
And yet when it comes back and looks at it, and when we get this, and see, that's where the disconnect. People who have had no opportunity to experience some of these things, or don't low, and or they're not comfortable with it.
Yeah.
And they, by dealing, and there's two ways of dealing that we talk about in treatment, numbing and avoidance. And I talked a little bit about in cognitive processing therapy, they have what's called stuck points. A stuck point is something that keeps you stuck in where you're at. And there's two types of stuck points that fit into that. The numbing is called an assimilated stuck point. I assimilate. I become part of. And it's part of what's called the just world theory, that, good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people.
Yep.
And so if something bad happened to me, I must be a bad people.
Right.
And that validates that, and it's not true, because we all know good things happening to bad people and bad things happening to good people. And, and you see that, in the Bible, it says the evil flourish while the righteous perish. I think that's in Psalms. But you go back and you say, well, that's not true. But if that's what you have burned into your brain, and then when good things do happen, we don't accept it because we don't deserve it. I don't deserve to succeed. I don't deserve to feel good because I'm a bad people. How do I know I'm a bad people? Because bad thing happened to me, and so I must be a bad people. And so within that, we use, how do we deal with it, and we use Socratic questioning. We work within that. Well, if you ever have you ever known a bad person that did have something good happen? Well, yeah, I guess. And you go through, and there's, the initial, is that true? I'm a bad person. Is that true? Is that absolutely true?
Ask
if
it.
you think it's true, how do you
Sit
feel?
down. Right.
But if you think I'm sometimes a bad person, and there's no straight poles, bad people do good things occasionally, good people do bad things occasionally.
Right.
And we put it into balance, and we want to have that balance so that there's more within there. So that's an assimilated stuck point. That's that numbing. I numb, I absorb into that worldview of this is what I deserve, this is what's at. I have stuck points like it's my fault because I didn't tell anybody, or even, I didn't rescue the whatever. The other one, the avoidance, is called over accommodation. And you have something happen with a person, individual, and you respond to it, and you say, okay, and you resolve it or don't resolve it, but you come up with it. Over accommodation means, I was assaulted by a man. I tell it with rape victims I work with. I was assaulted, so all men must be assault victims. They must all be rapists. They must all be within there. My friend lied to me, so everybody's going to lie to you at some point in time. They're going to let you down. That's that over accommodation. What's that do? Where numbing helps you accept the negative and not doing anything to heal. Over accommodation means you avoid the negative, and you never have a chance to practice tools that will go with there. And one of the things with cognitive processing therapy, if there's a lot of homework, if you do the homework, you do well. And it works. It works very well. It's one of the best models in 50 years as a mental health professional that I've ever seen. And if you don't, then it doesn't. It's just a big hassle of all this paperwork you have to do. And it really doesn't accomplish. But the tools within there basically deal with that. They deal with those two types of stuck points. They deal with how to challenge irrational thinking, and bring that into play. And there's some real good tools around how you look at that. And I've probably that's a 12-week sequence. I've probably taken, I think now, about 40 or 50 people through the whole 12-week sequence that's in there. But then there's also something that recently my wife Ann and I got trained in. I say recently, within the last 2 years, called cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. That's trauma therapy for couples.
Sure. And
the cool thing about my training in both of those, I was trained by the developer of the model.
Oh, okay.
Through the magical, wonderful world of Zoom.
Right.
And so, we're the only two people in Minnesota that are certified in cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. There's, I think, about 70 in the country. I'm one of 32 that's certified in cognitive behavior therapy outside of the VA. The VA does a lot of training around with a lot of those different kind of tools. And again, it's a very helpful, useful tool, and that's the kind of thing we should start doing more of that, because even if people don't have PTSD, and while you may not have PTSD, you have thinking errors sometimes within there, and the tools that I use with cognitive processing therapy, which is created for PTSD, I can also use some of those in people just with anxiety, depression, and areas within there. But would a man think of so is he?
Yeah. Sounds like you have some energy to do. You're doing a lot. You're in Southeast Minnesota.
Right.
Okay. And so we'll make sure that the link is available, but do you do in-person and Zoom or only in person?
Both.
You do both. Okay.
And so hopefully figure out what's wrong with my internet, because I have a HIPAA, I have a subscription, I have a HIPAA compliant version of Zoom that's encrypted, and so it's just the same as any compliant within there. And part of that is doing screening, and obviously right now I'm the only person doing this. I got another person with a graduate degree that may help me out on that. But right now, even if it's just having a conversation, and what's been kind of neat, it's cool the way God works. You've been in my office, and down at the end of the hall is a psychologist who does evaluations for the VA for PTSD and stuff like that. I'm not a licensed psychologist, PhD. My doctorate's in pastoral counseling. I'm licensed as a mental health professional, so I can diagnose and treat and all that other good stuff. And but there are people walking down there, and I see a guy the other day, he's got a Vietnam vet hat on, he's got a cane, and he's limping down, and it's one of the ones, I say it took me 50 years and Jennifer Schumacher to get my first rating. This guy's been going on since 73. And he's got 10% for tinnitus, and he should be at 100. But so I said, come on down, I guess I'll give you something. So him and his wife came down and sat in my office for about 15 minutes and drank some coffee, and Black Rifle coffee, which is vet coffee, And I gave him a book and signed it, and he went back to Waukon, Iowa, which is where he's from. And I says, here's, be in touch if it would help, but this is what you want to do. It's an amazing number of vets that don't know about VSOs.
Yep.
And VSOs, I've been honored to present to them that their state training a couple times, like 140, 150 VSOs in the same room. And I said, I'm at the Avengers headquarters. You folks, you men, you women are my heroes. And every vet out there, you're the tip of the spear, because unfortunately, and the people, the direct clinicians within the VA, I've had some real good, they're good people, but the bureaucracy that's involved in there, and is just, it's crazy. And 50% of the people, you don't have to be a vet to work for the VA. You have to be a vet to be a VSO, but you don't have to be a vet to work for the VA.
Sure.
And so, looking at that and how that comes into play, that's the stuff that VSOs and Wayne didn't know, and he's retired in '82, and that, but as a full bird colonel, you're at a different something, and he was told initially by the VA that he made too much money for them to give him any help.
Oh, yep.
And now he's at 80%.
Oh.
So Jennifer helped with that.
Yeah.
But that's the stuff, Carrie Allison, who works with American Legion, has been real helpful to me too. She lives up in Orinoco, and that's the ones that are out there. And Katie, that does the DAV things, is also the vet court coordinator, and I'm also involved in something called Vets Treatment Court. That is
You're
for
so
people.
Busy.
And well, what else would I do? I'm nothing against those that do, but I'm not going to play bingo.
No bingo for you.
All this, my hobby, and I'm a certified firearms instructor, and I do competitive shooting, and that's my hobby. And up by where you live, and
in Pine Island.
Yeah, and so, and that's that's what I'm going to do. And as long as my brain works, the body, they can wheel me in. I'm on the first floor. I'm planning on doing this until I can't.
Well, thank
And,
you.
you look at Wayne, he's 87. It's the same kind of thing. That's what keeps you alive. And research says people that just
Purpose.
go into their cocoon
Mm-hmm.
without and do that live an average of 2 to 3 years.
You have to have purpose.
So yeah, and
You have to have
so
some
that's
purpose.
purpose drives us.
Dr. Lansing, are you a member of the American Legion?
Yes, I am.
What post do you belong to?
I'm a nomad.
Oh, okay, so you're not connected to a post,
I
but you're a
have
member of the
never had
American
that
Legion.
connection. I'm
Okay.
a member of the VFW. I'm 1215, which is one in Rochester. DAV. I'm a life member with that. American Legion. I'm not connected. I'm not unwilling to. It's just never presented itself. And then I'm also a member. So if it's time for the draft,
No, I'm not here to draft you anyway. I'm just curious because I thought you were a member of the American Legion.
Yeah, I am.
You had mentioned it a while ago, and I thought I better draw that out a little bit more.
Yeah, but
So thank
like
you.
I say, all of those, and it's the kind of thing that that's out there really making a difference. And that's, but again, times change. We're doing a presentation at the Elks Club up in Red Wing the 25th. Some are veterans, some aren't, but they're real interested in veterans causes. The presentation I did with law enforcement, not all of them are veterans. A lot of law enforcement are, but not all of them. And so, there's that connection there as well. But those are the people that get it. Even if they understand it. Sometimes they can't, unless you've been through it, it's hard to say you get it. But if you understand, my wife isn't a veteran, but she loved me enough and cared enough that when I started having meltdowns around thunderstorms, and everybody else was mocking me and saying, "What's wrong with you? There's no Viet Cong in Iowa." Well, who knows? They got big cornfields, a good place to hide. And but she's been an awesome student on learning that. She's on our board also with Vets Empowered. But the organizations are the ones, and I talked to a person. I'm speaking at Stewartville tonight down there, and the big issues that are in play for the politicians, the vets on the Hill thing we're talking about, and things that people don't realize. And one of the big ones is the gambling issue within, and people don't realize that 30% of the money that vet organizations take in has to go to charity, and they buy fire equipment for hometowns, and they've helped us out, some of the clubs we've been able to get in front of, but they do scholarships for kids, they do fire equipment, police equipment, other things like that, and that's where that's going. That's a direct conduit right back into the community. When it comes to the appeals, it's the American Legion, and that's who did mine. It took me 4 tries to get tinnitus. And Carrie Ellison, who is with the American Legion, the one I mentioned out of Orinoco, and she's like a different part than from what Jennifer is. She's the one that got that done. It took a federal appeals judge.
That's
amazing. And so groups like the American Legion are out there, like VSOs are, supporting vets to get what they otherwise wouldn't be able to get. And that's what people need to understand. It's not just let's get together and have a few beers or whatever else like that. That happens too. But it's how do we meet the needs of a marginalized group that people don't really understand, but we do. And when I was up in Apple Valley that day, I didn't know anybody there. I met Dan one time, but I was home. And there was no question. And, that's the part that we need to stick together with each other and support each other in that way. And that's where the organizations, come into play.
Welcome to the family.
Yeah, that's the thing. The next book, my wife and I are talking about writing a book because we've done a lot of marriage counseling. We've probably worked with a couple thousand couples, and we've been married 52 years in May. And she's an RN. She's and I think you met her up at up in Apple Valley. But we have a title. We haven't written one word yet. But we got this conjoint therapy training. But the title of the book is going to be The Blank Check. And if you think about, when you join the military and there's a poster out and all this, and it's one of my slides and I do in my presentation, that you wrote a blank check up to and including the cost of your life that never goes invalid. Well, guess what? Guess whose signature is also on that check? Your family.
The family.
And so I've had wives of veterans say, I knew what I was sending out there. I was not prepared for what was coming back to me.
Yep.
And so that's kind of what we want to take a journey there. And even now, working with couples around and working with families. And I've had families come in of vets, and I go through, this is what happens to your brain, and they used to do this, your brain on drugs, where the guy cooked an egg on commercials back in the 80s and 90s. This is your brain on PTSD, and it's overly active. And I think Tim had that one picture that was in the article that was in the newspaper. This your brain on PTSD. This is what trauma does to your brain.
Yeah.
And it's funny, people say it's all in your head. Well, yeah, that's where your brain lives. So I guess they're right there. But now what? What do I do?
You don't have really control over it.
Yeah.
And I felt what I learned was the caregivers of military individuals were the silent keepers of the secrets of the real person.
Yeah.
And they were powerless to do anything about it because they wanted to keep the dignity of the person's individual respect in the community. They thought that there was all that shame connected to it, and so they kept that all those years. It was like
incredibly common. And that's the thing. And there's a TV show on called The Good Doctor, and which is about a surgeon who is an autistic savant who's like incredible. But one of the characters on there, her mother came back and said, your father had clinical. Father wouldn't want me to tell you this but he had clinical depression. And this is the first time we're going to reveal this. I hear that with people with all forms of mental health. I hear that with people with addictions. And there's a quote I saw one time that says, people with addictions are bathed in secrets hidden in shadows. And if you have diabetes, you're going to be pretty open about it, or high blood pressure, or whatever. But if you have any kind of mental health issue or any kind of an addiction issue, you're not. You try that. Go out to the mall and approach 100 people, and probably have trouble finding 100 people because the mall isn't really busy anymore. But and ask them, hey, I have clinical depression. I'm feeling suicidal. I have PTSD, and I've got 3 vets now that their significant others are trying to get their kids taken away from them because they have PTSD and they're too dangerous.
Yep.
And nothing could be further from the truth.
Yep.
And do we have a social? Research shows that people with PTSD are more apt to be victims than perpetrators.
And do we have a social responsibility to help somebody that served on behalf of a country?
Yes.
To bring them all the way home.
Yes. And that's a great message. Thank you.
And I think we do. I think we do.
I love what you're doing, and I look forward to us collaborating more on some things. And I imagine we're probably close to out of time, but this has been an honor. Thank you for asking me to speak to your audience, and anything more. We now have an office. I'm sitting in my therapy room, whatever you want to call it, or my cave, and and drinking my Black Rifle coffee, but But going out, it's not just what happens in this office. Of going out to groups, and we talked about one of the groups that we a few weeks ago got to meet was the Hmong population up in the cities, and they during Vietnam, I think I was told 30,000 of them served us, and then when we pulled out of Vietnam, the bureaucrats said, "Well, have a good life." And a number of them were killed. They were in primarily Laos and in Vietnam, and the Khmer Rouge and the Path at Lao, which were the two that
Yeah.
were there. You've seen the movie The Killing Fields, maybe, and one was, the Khmer Rouge was in Cambodia, and the Path at Lao was, and the Hmong have never had a home. They've never had a country. They started out in China, went to Mongolia, and now they're in Laos. There's 2,000 of them left, and they fought a commando war for the CIA. And so we ended up did some training with them, and I discovered that there is no Hmong word for amygdala and hippocampus. There's a lady that's a second generation Hmong who's a licensed psychologist that was there translating some of that, so I had to kind of dance around. But one of the gentlemen who went straight through a translator after I presented on the PTSD stuff, he rattled off some stuff in Hmong, and then I got translated, and he says to the group, he says, listen to what this guy's saying, because that's exactly what I've experienced too.
Yeah.
Different event, different situation, same impact. And that doesn't change for anybody. And it's a medical condition. It's nothing to be ashamed of. I have a shirt that says, PTSD is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign you could experience where other people weren't able to.
Thank you.
So that's the message. I'm going to, live that one until I no longer can. And so people out there that are listening, if even you just need somebody to consult with to help you have a better understanding, there's a quote, seek first to understand and be understood. And that's where tell me what happened to you, tell me your story, and understand what it's going to be, and understand, when my friend Wendell does that, when he has people tell the story, the group, when you hear that story, what do you think? What's your first thought? And thoughts in cognitive behavior therapy, an event happens, creates a thought, the thought creates a feeling, the feeling creates a stronger thought, stronger feeling, eventually that generates a behavior, and it leads to an outcome. That's cognitive behavior therapy, oversimplified.
Yep.
But depending upon what your core beliefs are, if I believe the world's an evil place and all people are bad, somebody smiles at me and I see them, I'm going to be suspicious. My thought is suspicion. My feeling is fear and guardedness and that kind of stuff. And so if you go back and you look at that, and that's where the stuck points come into play, what's your core belief? And how do you do that? Do you believe that you were here to serve or to be served? And that's going to impact on how you go about doing some of those things. And then there's also this word called stewardship, which most Christians know, and so that means you don't say yes to everything, but you do what you can do, and you tithe. My wife and I taught Sunday school yesterday, and we're doing a Sermon on the Mount, and we taught about your treasures. Store up your treasures in heaven, not here on earth. And all this, and what's that mean? And what's tithing mean? And now tithing isn't just giving your money in a collection plate. It means time, and it means energy and service and things like that. And that's the church that Calvary Freeway go to. Service is one of their main drivers. And that's part of where, as a Christian, as a man, as a human being, as a husband and a father and a therapist and all those other things, I'm here to serve. And God has blessed me with some skills, and I think a fair amount of intelligence. Some may question that from time to time, to be able to go out and do those things. And I've worked for free. I've worked with pretty good income. I did some consulting in the corporate world for a while, very well paid, but it wasn't fulfilling. So came back to do this. And so, that's part of that picture. We still have to survive. We still have to pay our bills. We still have to be responsible and accountable and all that. But that's where the line is. And what do we do with those gifts we've been given? Because we really don't own it. It's kind of like, with software. You don't own any of the software. You have a license to use that software. Same way with music. Well, you don't own anything, period. Your license, you have a license from God called stewardship that you go out there and
what are you going to
do
do
that.
with it?
And so, and then we got the 10%. So when I do talks, and you go to Malachi and Leviticus, it talks about the tithing and the 10%. So I start out that, and I held up a dollar bill. I says, "How much is this?" And everybody says, "It's a dollar bill." I go, "No, it's 90 cents." What does tithe mean? That 10%.
Right.
And it's the first 90. It's the first 10 cents. and you don't take, the ugliest, skankiest, diseased goats and give them for sacrifice. No, you give your
Right.
best goats, your best sheep, your best grain, and the best of God. But the cool thing is, and when we did this Max Lucado book, the very first miracle that Jesus did was the water into wine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why was that? You know, uh,
Mm-hmm.
he didn't heal the sick. He didn't world peace. He didn't drive the Romans out with flaming swords. He made wine,
He made wine
and
at a wedding.
not only did he make wine, but he made good wine. He
Yeah,
could have done $1 a box Ripple,
he could
but
have.
instead, the wine steward came to the bridegroom and said, "This is the good stuff. Why are you giving the good stuff now? They're
Yeah.
drunk by now. It's a 7-day wedding. Give them
Why?
anything. It's lighter fluid." But the
Yeah.
message, number one, no request is too small, and that's what Max Lucado is great. And we
Uh-huh.
got to meet him in Detroit probably 25 years ago
Oh,
at a
wow.
conference I was speaking at, and my
Uh-huh.
friend Wendell and I. But no request is too small. And
Mm-hmm.
so when Mary came to Jesus and said, "We got a problem,"
Mm-hmm.
you know, well, it was a request. Number two, when our prayers get answered, again, not what we want, but what we need, it's going to be the good stuff. It's going to be the good wine, not
Mm-hmm.
the cheap stuff. It's
Right.
going to be the good response because that's how God works. Now,
Mhm.
somewhere in there is the word faith,
Somewhere.
and that's what
Can
we
you
need to
trust
hang
that
on
God will
to.
do it for you? Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
And so when I see the drones heading toward Israel, that's what I was leaning on. So
Lean on to faith.
yeah.
Yes.
So
There's things that are beyond our control, but the things that are in our control. And
that's
we
what we
live
do.
for each other and with each other. And we could heal each other through compassion.
Very well
Mm.
spoken, Reverend Kelley.
Mm. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. You've given me over an hour, and I appreciate it so much because I know you're a busy person, and it
Well,
sounds like you're going to be very busy.
and I
So
would be glad to come back and reconnect. So let me know. Okay.
I have your email. I'm gonna end, and then I need you to hang on.
Okay.